Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Easy English Spark channel. I'm so glad you're here today, ready to embark on a new journey. Much like stepping into the real world after leaving a controlled environment, we're about to dive into something that will open doors for you, enhancing your English listening and speaking skills. Just like choosing to live freely in the world, it's your choice to speak confidently, fluently, and with ease. So let's break down the walls and spark up your English skills, making you feel right at home with every conversation. Let's get started and light up your English journey. Chapter 1. The Unfamiliar Awakening. It was sudden. One moment, everything was dark, and the next, I found myself awake. No gradual stirrings, no soft transition from sleep to wakefulness. I was simply awake. The stillness around me felt foreign, as if I had crossed into some other reality. I lay there for a moment, unsure of what had caused the abrupt change. The room was quiet, too quiet. The only sound was the soft hum of the world outside the window. I glanced at the clock on my nightstand. 7 a.m. I froze. 7 a.m. That couldn't be right. I wasn't supposed to be awake yet. I turned my head slowly, glancing at the bed beside me. Emily, my wife, was still asleep, her breathing steady and peaceful. We always woke up together, always at exactly 8 a.m. That's the routine. She'd always be the first to stir, nudging me awake with a gentle whisper, a soft touch. But today, something was off. I had woken up too early, and I couldn't shake the strange feeling that something wasn't right. I sat up quietly, trying not to disturb her. My feet touched the cool floor, and I felt the weight of the silence pressing in around me. The city outside, through the curtains, was still. Too still. There was no movement, no cars driving by, no people walking down the streets. It wasn't unusual for the mornings to be calm. But this felt different. I glanced out the window again, trying to shake off the discomfort gnawing at the back of my mind. But no matter how much I tried, I couldn't push away the feeling that something was wrong. Why had I woken up early? I tried to think. I couldn't remember ever waking up before 8 a.m. Not once. We had a rhythm, a life that followed a pattern. So why had I broken it? Was I just tired? No, this was more than that. I had the strange sensation that the very act of waking up felt like a violation of some unspoken rule. A rule that I couldn't quite put my finger on. I looked over at Emily again. She hadn't moved an inch. The stillness in the room deepened. I tried to push the unease aside, but it lingered in my chest, heavy and unrelenting. I glanced at the clock once more. 7:10 a.m. now. 10 minutes had passed since I first woke up, and yet nothing had changed. Still, no sound, no movement. The city outside remained as lifeless as ever. I stood up slowly, careful not to make any noise. I walked to the window and pulled the curtains open, letting the soft morning light pour into the room. The world outside still hadn't stirred. The streets were completely empty. No cars, no pedestrians, not even the usual morning hum of city life. It was as if everything had stopped, frozen in place. I turned back to the room, my eyes falling on Emily again. She was still sound asleep. There was something so unsettling about the way she was so unaware, so completely removed from the strange stillness that surrounded me. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves, but the feeling of wrongness wouldn't go away. What was going on? Why was I awake? And why did the world feel so unreal? I walked to the door, hoping that maybe stepping outside would help me clear my head. But as my hand touched the door handle, I froze. A thought had just occurred to me. What if this wasn't just a dream? What if this was real? I hesitated for a moment before stepping back into the room. I glanced at the clock again. 7:15 a.m., another 5 minutes. The time seemed to crawl, each second stretching out, pulling me deeper into the mystery of it all. Why had I woken up so early? Why was everything so still? And why was it so hard to remember what had happened before? I turned and walked back to the bed, sitting down beside Emily. I stared at her peaceful face, trying to recall the last thing we had done before falling asleep. What had we talked about last night? I couldn't remember. My mind felt foggy, like I was trying to reach for something just out of my grasp. But every time I tried to focus on it, the memory slipped further away. I placed my hand on her shoulder, gently shaking her awake. She stirred slightly, but didn't open her eyes. "Emily," I whispered softly. "Emily, wake up." After a few moments, she blinked and looked at me, still half asleep. "Leo?" she mumbled, her voice thick with sleep. "What's going on? Why are you awake so early?" I hesitated. I didn't know how to explain it to her. How could I put into words the unease that was consuming me? I took a deep breath and smiled, though it felt forced. "I just woke up early, that's all. I couldn't sleep." Emily rubbed her eyes and stretched. "Well, it's too early for breakfast. We've got time," she said, her voice full of that gentle calmness she always carried with her. She smiled at me and sat up in bed, her face soft with sleep. "We still have another hour before we have to get up." But the words she spoke felt off. It wasn't just the fact that she said we had time, it was the way she said it, as if everything was normal, as if nothing had changed. But I knew something was wrong. Something had shifted, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was the only one who noticed. I stood up again, my mind racing with questions. I couldn't explain it, but something was different. My body felt on edge, like I was in the middle of a dream I couldn't wake up from. The world outside the window was still, unchanging. Emily was talking about breakfast, and yet it all seemed too routine, too familiar. Was it possible that I had stepped into someone else's life? Someone else's reality? I didn't know, but I had to find out. I had to understand why everything felt so strange. Chapter 2. The Unspoken Question. I couldn't shake it. That feeling of unease lingered with me as I stood by the window, staring out at the silent city. The morning light was gentle, casting long shadows over the buildings below, but something about the quietness of the scene felt wrong. It wasn't just the absence of people, it was the stillness of it all. No movement, no hustle of life, no sound. Just an eerie calm that seemed to swallow the city whole. It wasn't the kind of calm you'd expect from a city waking up to a new day. It was as if everything was holding its breath, waiting for something that never came. I turned away from the window, my eyes falling on Emily again. She was still in bed, her face soft and relaxed. The sight of her brought me a little comfort, but only a little. I couldn't help but notice how completely unaware she seemed of the strange atmosphere that surrounded us. She was still tangled in the sheets, lost in her dreams, her chest rising and falling with each slow breath. She seemed out of place in this stillness, as if she were untouched by the growing uncertainty inside me. I glanced at the clock again. 7:30 a.m. Another 15 minutes had passed, and yet I still couldn't explain why I was awake, why I felt like the world had somehow shifted without my knowledge. Why did it feel like something was wrong? It was as if I had woken up in a place that wasn't mine, in a life that didn't fully belong to me. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe I was overthinking things. But even as the thought crossed my mind, I knew deep down it wasn't just my imagination. Something was wrong. I sat on the edge of the bed, watching Emily sleep. The quiet ticking of the clock on the wall was the only sound filling the room now, steady and unchanging. I reached out and gently brushed a strand of hair from her face, the softness of it grounding me for a moment. She looked so peaceful, so completely unaware of the storm of thoughts swirling inside me. But how could she not feel it? How could she not sense the unease that was starting to crawl under my skin, whispering that something wasn't right? I wanted to ask her. I wanted to ask if she felt it too, but the question stuck in my throat, like a word I couldn't quite speak. Was it just me? Was it just my mind playing tricks on me? Or was there something, some quiet force that was tugging at the edges of my reality, making me question everything I thought I knew? I couldn't help myself. I had to know. I leaned over and kissed Emily gently on the forehead. It wasn't a waking kiss. It was a soft touch, meant to pull her from the world of dreams, to draw her into the world where questions had no answers. Her eyelids fluttered, and she stirred groggily. "Leo," she murmured, still half asleep. Her voice was soft, laced with sleepiness. "What time is it?" 7:30, I said, though the words felt strange coming from my mouth. It wasn't time to wake up yet, but I needed to ask her something, to make sure I wasn't the only one feeling this odd disconnect. "Emily, do you feel it? Do you feel like something is off?" She blinked a few times, her gaze still hazy. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice thick with confusion. "What's off? It's just morning, Leo." Her response sent a ripple of frustration through me, but I held it back. How could she not feel it? How could she be so unaware? I had to stop myself from questioning her further, from pressing her too hard. Maybe it was just me. Maybe it was just the oddness of waking up early, of breaking our usual routine. I forced a smile and tried to shake off the lingering sense of disquiet. "Nothing, I guess. I was just thinking about today." She smiled back, a gentle curve of her lips, her eyes still heavy with sleep. "Well, you should get some rest," she said, shifting to sit up. "It's still early. We've got time before we have to get up." I nodded, but even as I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that we didn't have time, that there was something slipping through our fingers, something vital that I couldn't grasp, no matter how hard I tried. And as Emily stretched and rolled out of bed, I found myself wondering for the first time if she even knew who she was anymore, if I knew who I was. As I sat there, lost in thought, my mind racing to connect the pieces, I began to feel that familiar knot of panic tightening in my chest again. It was that same nagging feeling that something had been taken from me, taken from all of us, and we were living in the aftermath of something we couldn't quite remember. I stood up and walked to the bathroom, my reflection in the mirror greeting me like a stranger. I barely recognized myself. My eyes looked tired, a little too wide, like I had been awake for far longer than I really had. I washed my face with cold water, hoping it would clear my head, but it didn't. Instead, the unease deepened. It wasn't just the stillness outside. It was the feeling of being out of place, like I had slipped into someone else's life, someone else's skin. I needed to understand. I had to know what was happening to me, to us. I turned and walked back into the room, but Emily was gone. She had already started her morning routine, humming to herself as she went about her usual tasks. The normalcy of it all only made my confusion worse. She seemed so calm, so at ease in this routine. But wasn't it strange that we had never woken up apart? Wasn't it strange that today was the first time I had found myself awake before the usual time? Why did it feel like everything was happening in reverse? And why, above all, was I the only one asking these questions? I had to know the truth. I had to understand why I was awake, why the world felt like it had shifted, why the hours passed so slowly. I had to find out why I was the only one who seemed to notice. Chapter 3: A Silent Search. The morning continued as it always had, or at least that's how it appeared on the surface. Emily was already moving around the house, preparing for breakfast, humming a tune as she did every morning. I watched her from the doorway as she set out the usual things, the bowls, the plates, the cereal, and I couldn't help but feel a growing sense of disconnection. It wasn't that I didn't love her. No, that wasn't it. It was the quietness, the way everything seemed so routine, so perfectly orchestrated. But there was no depth to it, no realness. I had to do something. I had to search for answers, even if I wasn't sure what I was looking for. I felt like there was something hidden in plain sight, and I needed to uncover it. The feeling of being trapped in a reality that wasn't mine, or maybe it was, but it didn't feel right. It was like I was playing a part in a script I hadn't written, and every word I spoke, every action I took, felt rehearsed. "Leo, are you coming?" Emily's voice broke through my thoughts. She was already standing at the kitchen counter, her back to me as she began preparing the usual breakfast. I nodded absent-mindedly, not sure if I was still even listening to her. "I'll be right there," I muttered, though my voice sounded distant, even to myself. I turned and walked out of the room, my mind not really on the task at hand. I had to keep moving, keep searching. I couldn't sit still with these questions, bubbling inside of me, unspoken but overwhelming. I needed to figure out why I felt so out of place, why my body was here, yet my mind was adrift, lost in a sea of confusion. I started with the living room. I hadn't noticed anything unusual the night before, but today the furniture seemed different. Was it the light, or was it the fact that I hadn't really paid attention to the space around me? I walked over to the couch, running my fingers across the armrest. The fabric felt familiar, soft, comforting even. but it was too perfect. Too clean. There were no marks, no signs of wear and tear. How long had we had this couch? How many years had we lived in this apartment? I couldn't remember. The question lingered in my mind, but I didn't have the answer. I turned away from the couch and made my way to the small bookshelf in the corner of the room. Books, lots of them. Novels, biographies, guides. I was certain I had read many of them. I took one from the shelf at random. It was a history book, something I vaguely recognized from the past. But as I skimmed through the pages, I couldn't help but wonder, had I really read it? Or had I simply seen it so many times that the memory of reading it had been implanted? I shook my head, frustration building. No, this couldn't be it. This couldn't be the reality I had lived in. I put the book back, then moved into the hallway, eyes scanning the familiar frames on the wall, pictures of Emily and me, moments from trips we'd taken, holidays spent with friends. They looked like real memories, but they were distant, foggy in my mind. I couldn't place the moments exactly. I couldn't remember what it felt like to be there, in those photos. My hand hovered over one particular frame. It was a picture of us from our last vacation. We were standing on a beach, the sun setting behind us. Emily looked so happy. I looked content, but the smile felt unfamiliar. Was that really me? I swallowed hard and pulled my hand back. Something was wrong. I had to leave. I needed to get outside. Get away from these four walls that were closing in on me. Maybe fresh air would clear my head. I stepped out the door and into the hallway. The elevator was at the end, its doors closed, but I didn't hesitate. I had no idea why I was going to the elevator or even where I was going, but I felt compelled to get out, to see something, to feel something real. The elevator door opened as I approached, and I stepped inside. I hit the button for the ground floor without thinking. As the elevator began its descent, I tried to breathe. I needed to calm myself. I couldn't keep spiraling like this, questioning everything. But no matter how much I tried to push the feeling away, it only seemed to grow stronger. I glanced at my reflection in the elevator's polished walls. My face looked the same as it always had, tired, a little older. But there was something behind my eyes now, something that hadn't been there before, a flicker of recognition that I didn't quite understand. The elevator stopped, and the doors slid open with a soft chime. The ground floor was exactly how I remembered it. The same quiet lobby, the same polished marble floors. Everything was pristine, untouched, like it had never been disturbed. I stepped out into the hallway, but the stillness of it all made my skin crawl. It was almost too perfect, too staged. Where was everybody? Where was the usual hum of life? The hustle and bustle of the morning rush? I walked towards the exit, my footsteps echoing in the silence. I pulled open the door to the outside world. But when I stepped into the fresh air, the emptiness of the street hit me hard. The city was deserted. No cars, no pedestrians, no sounds. Just the faint whisper of the wind. It wasn't the usual quiet of early morning. This was different. This was wrong. I stood there for a moment, taking in the scene, my heart pounding in my chest. The buildings loomed around me, but they too seemed empty, hollow. The streets were pristine, untouched by time or life. The world outside felt too still, too staged. I walked down the sidewalk, my footsteps heavy against the silence. Something in me urged me to keep moving, to keep searching for answers. But what was I looking for? What could I possibly find in a city that felt so empty, so void of life? I rounded a corner and found myself standing at the entrance of a small park. A bench sat there under a large tree, and I felt a strange pull towards it. I sat down, looking out at the empty path ahead of me. This was where I should have felt at ease, where I should have felt familiar. But all I felt was the gnawing emptiness that had taken root in my chest. I tried to focus on the surroundings, on the trees, the grass, the benches. They were all the same, no different than the world I had left behind. But I still couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. Something vital. I looked up at the sky, the same clear blue it had always been, and asked myself the question that had been haunting me for hours. Why couldn't I remember? I had no answer. All I had was a sense of being lost, a sense of something slipping away, like sand through my fingers. I didn't know where to go or what I was supposed to be doing, but I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't just sit here, in the silence, waiting for something to happen. I had to keep searching. I had to understand what was happening to me, to Emily, to this city. I stood up abruptly, my legs trembling slightly. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was the weight of the unknown pressing down on me. And with that weight came the realization that the answers I sought were just out of reach, hidden behind a veil I couldn't pierce. But I wasn't going to stop. I couldn't. I had to know the truth, no matter how hard it was to find. Chapter 4. The Odd Routine. The sun had risen higher in the sky by the time I made my way back inside. The soft light filtered through the curtains, casting an almost warm glow over the apartment. Emily was at the kitchen counter, her movements automatic, as if the world hadn't shifted at all. She hummed a familiar tune as she poured cereal into a bowl, her face serene and untouched by the disquiet that had settled in my chest. It was the same as every morning. She moved with ease, as if nothing had changed, nothing had ever been amiss. But the more I watched her, the more disconnected I felt from everything around me. The way she worked, the way she spoke, everything felt too routine, too perfect. The motions were repeated day after day, as though on autopilot. No surprises, no deviations. It was as if we were stuck in an endless loop, forever playing the same scenes with no end in sight. I tried to shake it off, tried to remind myself that maybe I was just tired, overthinking things, but the feeling wouldn't leave. The unease was like a persistent whisper in the back of my mind, urging me to look closer, to question everything I thought I knew. "Leo, sit down." "Breakfast is ready," Emily called, pulling me from my thoughts. I nodded absently and took a seat at the table, my eyes drifting over the spread in front of me. It was the same as always: cereal, milk, a small glass of orange juice. Simple, predictable. I'd had this breakfast 100 times, maybe more, yet today it felt wrong. I couldn't explain it. This routine, this sameness, it was suffocating. How could something so ordinary suddenly feel so foreign? Emily sat down across from me, her eyes bright, her smile calm and natural. She picked up her spoon and began eating, her movements graceful, as though this was the most normal thing in the world. But I couldn't join her in that sense of ease. I sat there staring at my bowl, unable to take a bite. "What's wrong?" she asked, glancing up at me with a look of concern. "You're not eating." I shook my head, though I didn't feel convinced by my own response. "I'm not hungry," I said quietly, hoping it sounded convincing. She frowned but didn't push further. Instead, she smiled and changed the subject. "Well, we have a busy day ahead," she said, her tone light, almost chipper. "After breakfast, we'll head to the park. Then later, there's that yoga class you wanted to try. Don't forget, we have dinner plans with the Thompsons at 7 p.m. You're going to love the food, I'm sure of it." I nodded without thinking. It all sounded so rehearsed, too planned. Every day felt like a checklist, a set of instructions that we followed without ever questioning why. But why was I questioning now? Why wasn't I content with the way things had always been? I glanced at my watch. 8:15 a.m. I should have felt a sense of comfort, of knowing exactly what was coming next. But instead, all I felt was a growing knot of anxiety in my stomach. There was no excitement for the yoga class, no joy in the plans for the evening. It was just another day in a string of endless days. It was like we were living in a routine that had been carefully crafted, one that left no room for deviation, for change. I stood up abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. Emily looked up at me, surprised. "I'm just going to get some fresh air," I muttered, more to myself than to her. She nodded with a smile, oblivious to the storm inside me. "Okay, Leo, don't be too long. We need to leave soon." I stepped out onto the balcony, taking a deep breath of the fresh morning air. The city stretched out before me, the same skyline I had seen countless times. But now it felt different. The buildings were too clean, too polished. The streets were quiet, like they were waiting for something to happen. But nothing ever did. There was no hustle and bustle of people rushing to work, no sounds of traffic, no life. The streets were eerily silent, and the few figures that moved around seemed to be moving in slow motion, as if they too were part of a dream. I leaned against the railing, trying to clear my mind. Was I imagining all of this? Was I just making a mountain out of a molehill? Maybe. Maybe I was just tired. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. There was something wrong. I had woken up early this morning, before Emily. That was the first sign. Then the strange stillness of the world outside, and now this routine. This life that felt like it had been stitched together from memories that didn't quite belong to me. I closed my eyes and tried to focus on the familiar sounds of the city, but the silence seemed to swallow everything. No cars, no people, not even birdsong, just the quiet hum of the world, a low and constant murmur, like the sound of an engine idling, waiting for something to start. A few moments passed before I heard the door behind me open. I turned to see Emily standing there, her smile still intact, but there was something in her eyes, a flicker of concern. "Are you sure you're okay?" she asked gently. I nodded, though I wasn't sure I was convincing anyone, least of all myself. I just needed a moment to think. She stepped forward, placing a hand on my arm. "Well, think fast," she said, a playful edge to her voice. "We don't want to be late for yoga," I smiled back, though it didn't quite reach my eyes. "Right, yoga." She turned to walk back inside, but I stayed rooted to the spot, staring out at the city. The knot in my stomach tightened. I had to understand. I had to find out what was happening. Why did it all feel like a performance? Why did everything seem so artificial, so designed? I followed her back inside, the apartment now feeling smaller, more confining than before. The walls seemed to close in around me as I walked back into the kitchen, where she was already cleaning up, wiping down the counter, organizing the dishes. It was all so perfect, so predictable, and yet something about it all unsettled me more than anything else ever had. "Ready?" Emily asked, glancing at me over her shoulder, a soft smile playing on her lips. I nodded again, though my mind was far from ready. I wasn't just ready to go through the motions anymore. I wasn't ready to let the days blur together in the same endless pattern. Something had to change. I couldn't just keep pretending that everything was fine, because it wasn't, and deep down I knew it. Chapter 5. The Reflection. The day seemed to drag on in a haze, a blur of familiar routines and monotonous tasks. After breakfast, we went through the motions, Emily with her yoga class, me with my half-hearted attempts to join in. I went through the stretches and poses, but my mind wasn't really on the movements. I couldn't focus. My body followed the instructions, but my mind felt miles away. It was as if I was watching myself from a distance, disconnected from everything around me. I kept thinking about the same thing, the feeling that something wasn't right. The emptiness that surrounded us, the lack of sound, of movement, of life. It was as if we were the only people left in the world, trapped in a world of our own making. And the more I tried to push the thoughts away, the more they came rushing back. I excused myself early from the class, citing a headache. I had been avoiding it for days, but today I couldn't take it any longer. The yoga room felt too tight, too suffocating, as if the walls were closing in. Emily, of course, didn't question me. She smiled and told me to rest, completely unaware of the chaos inside my mind. I walked back to our apartment, my footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. The building was eerily quiet, as it always was. I passed by the elevator, its doors closed, but I didn't hesitate this time. I needed to be alone. I needed to see myself, to confront the face staring back at me. I made my way to the bathroom and stood in front of the mirror. The cool light from above illuminated my reflection, and for a moment, I just stared. My eyes seemed distant, unfocused, as if they were looking at something far away. My face looked the same, tired, a little worn around the edges. But there was something else there now, a flicker of something I couldn't quite place. I ran my fingers through my hair, trying to focus, trying to pull myself back into the moment. But the longer I stared at my reflection, the more foreign it became. It was like I was seeing a stranger, someone who didn't quite belong to me, someone who didn't fit into the life I thought I had. The questions swirled in my mind. Who was I really? Was this the life I had built for myself? Was this the reality I had chosen, or had it been chosen for me? Every day felt like a scripted performance, like I was playing a part in a play I had never auditioned for. I knew the lines, I knew the routine, but there was no soul behind it, no meaning. I leaned closer to the mirror, searching for some sign that the person looking back at me was really me. I studied my eyes, the way they looked back at me with an intensity I hadn't seen before. It was as if I was finally seeing something hidden beneath the surface, something I had been blind to for so long. I reached out and touched the glass, my fingers pressing against the cool surface. It felt like a barrier, a wall between who I was and who I was supposed to be. A wall that had been built up over time, brick by brick, until I couldn't remember who I was without it. The reflection in the mirror didn't give me any answers, though it only gave me more questions. I pulled away from the mirror, frustrated. I didn't know what I was looking for. I didn't know what I wanted to see. But whatever it was, I couldn't find it. I couldn't escape the feeling that something was missing, that something in my life, something in my mind, was broken. But what? What was it that I couldn't remember? What was it that I was meant to see but couldn't? I walked out of the bathroom and sat on the edge of the bed, burying my face in my hands. I had to think. I had to make sense of all of this. I had to figure out what was happening to me, to us, to this world. But every time I tried to focus, the thoughts seemed to slip away, like water running through my fingers. I could hear Emily moving around in the other room, humming to herself as she cleaned up. It was like she was living in a different reality, one that I couldn't reach. She was so content, so sure of everything. But I couldn't share that certainty. I couldn't share that peace. Not when everything around me felt like a lie. A part of me wanted to tell her, to ask her if she felt it too. But another part of me was afraid. Afraid that if I said the words out loud, I would sound insane. That I would sound like someone who had lost his grip on reality. I wasn't sure if I was ready to face that. Instead, I stood up and walked to the window. I needed to see something, anything, that would tell me the truth. The city stretched out before me, exactly the same as it always had. The streets were empty, the buildings lined up in neat rows, the sun casting long shadows across the pavement. But the more I looked at it, the more it felt like a facade, like a picture I was looking at through a frame, but I couldn't reach it. I couldn't touch it. The world outside the window seemed distant, too far away to feel real. The life that we were living, this perfect, unchanging routine, didn't feel real either. It was as if we were all actors in a play, following a script we didn't remember writing. And the more I tried to follow the lines, the more disconnected I felt from myself. I turned away from the window and looked back at the apartment, the place that I called home. But did I really know it? Did I really know this life? Or was I just playing a part, repeating the same actions day after day without ever questioning why? I had to break free. I had to find out what was happening. I couldn't live like this anymore, trapped in a reality that didn't feel real. I didn't care what it took. I had to remember. I had to know who I was, where I came from, and why everything felt so strange. I looked at my reflection once more. The same face stared back at me, but this time I wasn't sure if I recognized it. Was it really me? Or had I become someone else? Someone I couldn't even remember? Chapter 6. A Sudden Memory. The evening came, but it felt just as empty as the hours before. Emily had gone out to meet some friends, leaving me alone in the apartment once again. I hadn't told her about the turmoil swirling in my mind. She wouldn't understand. She couldn't. She was content, oblivious to the weight pressing on my chest, the creeping sense of disconnection from everything I thought I knew. I had spent the past few hours walking around the apartment, my feet carrying me aimlessly from room to room. I'd stopped in front of the mirror again, but this time I didn't linger. I couldn't. I had already spent enough time studying the face staring back at me, trying to make sense of it. But the reflection never changed. I was still just me, or at least the version of me that I recognized. But what did that mean? The silence was overwhelming, the kind that settles deep in your bones, making everything feel too still. There was no ticking clock, no hum of life outside the apartment. Only the silence, the kind that made it impossible to think clearly. It was as if the world outside had stopped moving, and I was stuck, suspended in a moment that never ended. Walked over to the window again and looked out at the city below. The streets were dark now, the lights from the buildings casting long shadows on the pavement. It looked almost like a ghost town. Where were the people? Where were the lives being lived? It didn't feel real. It didn't feel like a place that should be inhabited by anyone, let alone by me. I leaned my forehead against the cool glass, trying to steady my breath. I didn't know how much longer I could keep going like this, trapped in a world that didn't seem to make sense. The frustration bubbled up inside me again, and I slammed my fist against the window pane, startling myself with the force of the action. For a moment, everything was quiet again, but then something happened. A sudden flash of memory surged through my mind like a burst of light breaking through a storm. It was so vivid, so real, that it almost knocked the breath out of me. I saw it clearly. I was standing in a small, cramped apartment, packing a bag. There was a suitcase on the floor beside me, half filled with clothes. My hands were shaking. As I folded a shirt and placed it inside, I didn't know where I was going, but I knew it was important. I knew that I couldn't stay here. But the thing that struck me the most was the feeling, the urgency. I was desperate to leave, desperate to escape. I shook my head, trying to shake the memory free, but it clung to me like a shadow that wouldn't let go. I tried to focus on it, tried to piece together the fragments. Where was I? What had I been running from? But just as quickly as it came, the memory began to fade, slipping through my fingers like water. I couldn't hold on to it no matter how hard I tried. My heart raced as I desperately grasped at the fleeting image, but it was already gone. The feeling, the urgency, the need to leave, all of it vanished, leaving me with nothing but the hollow sense of having lost something crucial. I took a step back from the window, my head spinning. The memory was still there, lingering at the edges of my mind, but I couldn't quite capture it. What did it mean? Why had it come to me now? I stood there in the silence, trying to process what had just happened. It wasn't like the memories I had been struggling with earlier. This one felt different. It felt more real, like it was tied to something deeper, something important. But what? I turned away from the window and walked across the room, my mind racing. I needed to figure out what this memory meant. It couldn't be random. It couldn't just be a fleeting thought. There had to be a reason for it. There had to be a connection to the life I had been living, or the life I thought I had been living. As I walked past the kitchen counter, my eyes fell on the photo of Emily and me, the one from our last vacation, the one where we were standing together on the beach. I stopped, staring at it for a moment. A strange feeling washed over me, something familiar yet unsettling. The faces in the photo looked so happy, so at peace, but there was something about it that felt off. The memory, the one that had flashed through my mind just moments ago, suddenly came rushing back. I was packing my bag, but it wasn't just any bag. It was a suitcase. I had to leave, but where was I going? The urgency to escape was overwhelming. I was running from something. But what? What was chasing me? I could see myself standing in that small apartment again, the suitcase at my feet, the room dimly lit, and the world outside seemed so far away. But the more I tried to focus on the memory, the more it seemed to slip from my grasp. I couldn't hold on to it long enough to make sense of it. I sat down on the couch, feeling dizzy. My heart was still racing, and the adrenaline from the memory rush had left me breathless. It felt like something was starting to click into place, like I was beginning to understand something that had been hidden from me. But what was it? What was the truth? I stood up and walked over to the shelf, grabbing the book I had seen earlier that day, the history book. I opened it to a random page, hoping that somehow, someway, it would give me a clue. But the words were just words. They didn't mean anything, not in this moment. I slammed the book shut, frustration building again. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this memory, that it wasn't just some fleeting thought, some random image that had popped into my head. It was real. It had to be. I walked back to the window and stared out at the city again. But this time I wasn't just looking at the buildings. I was searching for something I couldn't quite put into words. The memory felt like a puzzle piece, and I was just starting to see where it might fit. I didn't know how much time had passed, but the weight of the memory was starting to settle inside me. It was like the start of a trail, a path that I needed to follow. And though I didn't have all the answers yet, I knew one thing for sure. This was just the beginning. I had remembered something. And that meant there was hope. There was a way out of this maze of confusion. Chapter 7: The Truth Unveiled. The weight of the memory had been pressing down on me for hours. It wasn't just the flash of the suitcase or the urgency to escape. It was everything. The quiet, the stillness, the emptiness that seemed to surround me, as though I were standing on the edge of a vast chasm, peering into something I wasn't supposed to see. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine, that I was just overreacting. No, something was wrong, terribly wrong. I had spent the last few hours walking aimlessly around the apartment, my thoughts tangled in confusion. The silence in the house felt suffocating now. I had to know the truth. I had to know what was going on, and I couldn't wait any longer. I sat down at the kitchen table, staring at the half-empty cup of coffee in front of me. It had been like this for weeks now, this strange routine, this forced normalcy. And every day I tried to ignore the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. But today, after the memory, after that sudden flash of urgency and fear, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I wasn't going to let myself be trapped in this illusion. I took a deep breath and stood up from the table, my hands shaking as I moved to the hallway. I had to go somewhere, do something. I couldn't just sit here any longer, letting this strange, suffocating silence close in on me. I walked toward the door, my feet heavy with determination. I wasn't sure where I was going, but I knew I had to get out. The need to understand was consuming me, pushing me forward. I opened the door and stepped out into the hallway, my mind racing. The building was as quiet as always. No sounds, no movement, just the emptiness. It made my skin crawl. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't stay in this world that seemed to be built on nothing but shadows and lies. I made my way down the hallway, my eyes scanning the doors as I passed. They were all identical, perfectly aligned, like rows of dominoes waiting to fall. There was no life behind them, no sounds of laughter, no arguments, no families. just silence. Everything was too perfect, too still, as though someone had curated this existence to feel comfortable, to feel safe. But I wasn't comfortable. I wasn't safe. I was suffocating. I found myself standing in front of the elevator again. The doors slid open automatically, and I stepped inside without thinking. My fingers trembled as I pressed the button for the ground floor, but I didn't hesitate. I needed answers, and I knew that I wasn't going to find them sitting here, in this apartment, surrounded by the walls of my confusion. The elevator hummed softly as it descended, and I watched the numbers on the panel flicker, each one bringing me closer to the ground floor. My heart was pounding now, the anticipation almost too much to bear. I felt like I was walking into the unknown, like I was about to uncover something that would shatter everything I thought I knew. But I wasn't afraid. Not anymore. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and I stepped into the lobby. It was just as silent here as it had been in the apartment, but there was something different about it now, something that felt more sinister, more final. I walked toward the main entrance, my footsteps echoing in the vast, empty space. There was no one in sight, no one waiting at the door, no one sitting at the reception desk. The place felt abandoned. Pulled open the door and stepped outside into the city. The streets were still empty. The buildings stretched above me, towering like silent sentinels, their windows reflecting the dimming light of the setting sun. The world was still, too still. But this time it wasn't just an eerie quietness. This time it felt wrong. It felt manufactured. I walked through the streets, my pace quickening, my mind racing with questions. Where was everybody? Where had all the people gone? Why was the city so empty? I turned a corner, my eyes scanning the street ahead of me, when I saw something that made my blood run cold. At the far end of the street there was a building, an old, unmarked structure that I hadn't noticed before. It was out of place. Its dark windows stared back at me like empty eyes, and the door was slightly ajar. Without thinking, I walked toward it. The closer I got, the more I felt like I was being drawn in, like there was something I needed to see, something I couldn't avoid any longer. I pushed open the door and stepped inside. The air was thick with dust, and the building smelled musty, like it hadn't been touched in years. The dim light from the street outside barely illuminated the hallway, casting long, stretching shadows across the floor. I hesitated for a moment before moving forward. Something about this place felt familiar, but not in a comforting way. It felt like a memory I couldn't quite recall, a forgotten truth waiting to be uncovered. I walked down the hallway, the silence wrapping around me like a shroud. The further I went, the more I felt like I was being led somewhere, like I was walking into the heart of the mystery that had been plaguing me for days. I reached the end of the hall and found a door that stood ajar, just like the one outside. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was dimly lit, with rows of monitors lining the walls. The screens flickered, showing static at first, but then slowly they cleared. I could see faces I didn't recognize, people I had never seen before, but they were all staring at the camera, staring at me. I froze. The room was filled with computers, machines, and equipment I couldn't understand. But the faces on the screens, they were all staring at me, and I knew that I had seen them before. They weren't strangers. They were people from my life. People I had known. People who were supposed to be here, in this world, with me. But where were they? Why weren't they here? I turned around, my heart hammering in my chest. A figure stood in the doorway. A man. He was tall, with sharp features and a stern expression. I didn't know him, but he seemed familiar somehow, like I had seen him in a dream, or perhaps in one of my memories. He stepped forward and I instinctively took a step back. "You're awake," he said, his voice low and calm, but there was something unsettling about it. "It's time you understood." "What is this?" I asked, my voice shaking. "What's going on? Where is everybody?" The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked over to one of the monitors and pressed a button. The screen flickered. Again. And then I saw something that made my stomach drop. It was an image of the city, but it wasn't the city I knew. It was a replica, a simulation. "This," he said, "is where you've been. And this is where you've been living." I felt my heart stop. The truth hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't real. None of it was. "You've been living in a controlled environment," he continued. "A carefully constructed world designed to keep you content, safe. But now, the truth is starting to surface. And it's time you remembered everything." The pieces were finally falling into place. The emptiness, the routine, the strange memory of packing the suitcase. It all made sense now. I wasn't living in a city. I wasn't living in a real world. I was part of an experiment, a controlled environment where memories were erased, where everything was fabricated to create a perfect existence. But it wasn't real. It was all a lie. I turned to the man, my voice trembling with disbelief. "Why? Why me? Why are we here?" The man's expression softened just for a moment. "Because you were chosen to be part of this. But you weren't meant to remember. Not until now." I stood there, my mind spinning, trying to process everything he had just told me. The city, the people, the perfect routine. It was all a lie. A manufactured world to keep us trapped in a lie of contentment. But why had I remembered? Why now? "Do you want to leave?" he asked, his tone almost casual. "Do you want to know what's beyond this world?" I swallowed hard, my chest tightening. I had a choice. But could I ever go back to the life I had known? Could I live in a world that wasn't controlled, where the truth was raw and unforgiving? "I don't know," I said softly. "I just want to know the truth." Chapter 8. The Escape. The truth, once unveiled, felt like a heavy weight, pressing down on my chest. The man in front of me, this stranger who had appeared from nowhere, had finally confirmed everything I had suspected, everything I had feared. I had been living in a lie. This city, this perfect little world, wasn't real. It was a simulation, a carefully constructed environment designed to keep us complacent, content. But nothing about it felt real. Not anymore. I stood there, my mind racing, the weight of the truth threatening to collapse me in on myself. The monitors in front of me flickered, showing images of people I had known, faces I recognized, but none of them were here, not really. They were just projections. People who existed only to make me believe that my life had meaning, that I was living in a world where things had purpose. But none of it was real. Not the city, not the routine, not the memories I had been clinging to. All of it was a carefully orchestrated play, a dream I couldn't wake up from. The man, who I still didn't know, watched me silently, his eyes fixed on me with a calmness that unnerved me. He didn't look angry or even concerned. He was simply there, like a guide, waiting for me to take the next step, waiting for me to make my choice. And now, for the first time in what felt like forever, I had a choice. "Do you want to leave?" His voice cut through my thoughts. It was low and measured, like he had asked this question 1,000 times before. I stared at him, feeling the weight of the question settle in my chest. Leave? Was that even possible? How could I leave? What was beyond this place? These questions bounced around in my mind like echoes, reverberating, refusing to be silenced. "Where would I go?" I finally asked, my voice rough, strained from the shock of everything I had learned. The man didn't answer immediately. He seemed to consider my question for a moment before speaking. His tone still calm, still unsettlingly serene. "Somewhere real," he said simply. "You've been in this controlled environment for too long. There's a world out there, beyond this city. A world that isn't constructed for you, but one that's real, and you'll have to fight for it. Nothing is handed to you. Fight? The word echoed in my mind. Fight. That wasn't what I had signed up for. I had spent so long trying to understand this place, trying to make sense of it all, but now it felt like I was being asked to step into a world I had no preparation for. A world that was raw, real, and brutal in its uncertainty. But as I stood there, the realization settled into my bones. I couldn't stay. Not in this artificial world, not in a life where everything was laid out for me, where I was nothing more than a puppet, controlled by forces I didn't understand. I needed to break free. I want to leave, I said, the words tasting like freedom on my tongue, even as they terrified me. The man nodded, as though he had expected nothing else. Without a word, he moved to one of the monitors and pressed a few buttons. The screen flickered again, and then it changed, revealing a map of the city. No, not the city I had been living in. This was something different. It was a real map. A map of the outside world. A world I had never seen, but one that I instinctively knew was the place I was supposed to be. There's an exit, he said. A way out. It's not easy, and you'll need to be careful. They'll be watching. They always are. I felt a chill run down my spine at the thought. They. Who were they? Who had built this world? Who was in control of all of this? I wanted to ask, but the words caught in my throat. I didn't need to know right now. All I knew was that I couldn't stay here any longer. I walked over to the map, my fingers tracing the route that led outside, away from this place. Away from the life I had been living. The path wasn't long, but it wasn't straightforward either. There were checkpoints, security measures, places where I would need to be discreet, places where I might have to hide. It was a labyrinth, designed to keep me contained, to make sure no one ever found their way out. But I wasn't afraid. Not anymore. The fear that had been lingering in my chest for so long had been replaced with a fierce determination. I was going to leave. I was going to find my way out of this prison, this cage they had built around me. Are you sure? The man asked, his voice still calm, almost as though he were speaking to someone who wasn't quite ready to make the leap. Looked at him, my eyes hardening with resolve. I'm sure. He nodded again and stepped aside, as if he were giving me permission to leave, though I knew that I didn't need it. I had made my decision. I was ready. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something small, rectangular, and metallic. A key card. He handed it to me, the weight of it cold in my palm. It was the key to everything. To my freedom. To my escape. This will get you through the first door, he said. From there, it's up to you. But be careful. You can't trust everything you see. Trust no one but yourself. With that, he turned and walked away, disappearing down the hallway, leaving me standing there, holding the key to my freedom. I didn't hesitate. I didn't think twice. I had to go now. I turned and walked out of the room, my steps echoing in the silence of the building. The hallway was empty, just as it had been before, but it felt different now. It felt like it was no longer my home, no longer my world. It felt like a prison that I had outgrown, and I was ready to leave it behind. I made my way to the exit, the key card burning in my hand. As I reached the door, I inserted the card into the slot, and the door clicked open with a soft hiss. The world outside was darker now, the night settling over the city, but it didn't feel cold. It felt like freedom. I stepped outside, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I took a deep breath of fresh air. The real air. The air of a world that wasn't controlled, that wasn't scripted. It smelled different, alive, vibrant, full of possibilities. I didn't know what was out there. I didn't know what I would find. But I didn't care. I was free. And that was all that mattered. The path ahead of me was uncertain, but for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of it. I was ready to face whatever came next. And as I walked away from the place I had known for so long, I finally understood something. The truth, the freedom, the escape. It had always been within me. I just had to take the first step, and I had. Chapter 9. The Outside World. I took a deep breath, feeling the cool night air fill my lungs for the first time in what felt like an eternity. The world outside was nothing like the sterile, controlled environment I had known. There were no artificial lights, no false smiles, no carefully curated routines. This was the real world, a place that had been hidden from me, a place that felt as alien as it did familiar. The first thing I noticed was the noise. The city hummed with life, the distant sound of traffic, the murmur of conversations, the occasional honk of a car horn. It was chaotic, but it was real. The world I had left behind had been silent, unnervingly quiet. But here, everything was alive, vibrating with energy, with purpose. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, just taking it in. It felt overwhelming, like stepping into a new reality where I had no place. The lights from the street lamps cast long shadows on the ground, and the streets were busy with people moving in every direction. They didn't seem to notice me at first, caught up in their own lives, their own routines. And why would they? I was just another face in the crowd, someone who didn't belong here, someone who had been shielded from the truth for far too long. I looked around, trying to make sense of it all. Buildings towered above me, some old and crumbling, others sleek and modern. The air smelled different, too. There was a mixture of exhaust fumes, food from a nearby cart, the scent of rain on the pavement. It wasn't the clean, sterile air I was used to, but it was real, it was raw, it was life. I walked forward, unsure of where I was going, but not caring anymore. I wasn't following a script now. I wasn't following anyone's rules. For the first time, I was free. But freedom didn't come without its challenges. I passed a small cafe on the corner, the faint sound of music drifting through the door. I hesitated for a moment, then stepped inside. The smell of fresh coffee and baked goods filled the air, and the warmth from the inside of the cafe enveloped me. The people sitting at the tables didn't look up as I entered, lost in their own conversations, their own worlds. But as I walked up to the counter, the barista looked at me, and for a moment I could see the curiosity in her eyes. She didn't ask me any questions. She just gave me a nod and waited for my order. "What can I get for you?" she asked in a soft voice. I blinked, momentarily taken aback by the simplicity of the question. "Just a coffee," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Black." She smiled, a small, kind smile, and turned to prepare my order. I watched her for a moment, the simple act of making coffee seeming so mundane, so natural. She wasn't a part of the illusion, not like the people I had known in the city I had just escaped. No, she was real. Her life was real. And for the first time, I felt a pang of longing, a sense of loss for the world I had left behind. But I couldn't go back. I couldn't live in that illusion anymore, not when I knew the truth. When the coffee was ready, she slid it across the counter with a smile. I thanked her quietly and left the cafe, stepping back out into the street. The world around me was a blur of motion. People rushing past me, cars zooming by, the faint hum of streetlights above. I had no destination, no plan. But it didn't matter. I was no longer confined by the boundaries of my previous life. The freedom was exhilarating and terrifying all at once. There was so much to take in, so much to understand. How had I spent so many years trapped in that artificial world? How had I allowed myself to be lulled into a life that wasn't mine? As I walked through the streets, I couldn't help but notice the stark contrast between this world and the one I had left behind. There were cracks in the sidewalks, graffiti on the walls, the unmistakable signs of decay and neglect. But there was also life, real life. People arguing on street corners, laughing in cafes, rushing to catch buses. Some had their heads down, lost in their phones, while others engaged in loud, passionate debates. It was chaotic. It was imperfect. But it was real, and that was what mattered. I kept walking, not sure where I was going, only knowing that I had to keep moving. There were no rules here, no one telling me where to go or what to do. There were no restrictions, no barriers. But I was also aware of the danger. This was the world of unpredictability, a place where I had no control, no certainty. And yet, I was drawn to it. The unknown didn't scare me anymore. The world was vast and open, filled with possibilities, filled with the truth. As the night deepened, I found myself standing at the edge of a park, the streetlights casting long shadows across the grass. I paused for a moment, looking out at the empty benches, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. I sat down on one of the benches, feeling the cool air brush against my skin. I was exhausted, both physically and mentally. The weight of everything that had happened was finally sinking in. I had escaped, but the road ahead was still uncertain. I didn't know what I was supposed to do now, where I was supposed to go. The world was vast, and I was just a small piece of it. But for the first time, I felt like I had a chance. A real chance to live, to experience everything I had been denied. As I sat there, the sound of footsteps approached. I looked up to see a figure walking towards me. It was a man, dressed in a long coat, his face partially obscured by the hood of his jacket. He didn't seem to notice me at first, but then he stopped a few feet away and looked directly at me. His eyes were intense, studying me with an almost knowing gaze. "Are you lost?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. I shook my head, the question catching me off guard. "No," I said, my voice stronger than I expected. "I'm not lost. Not anymore." He nodded slowly, as if he understood. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the park. I watched him go, feeling a strange sense of peace settle in my chest. There were people out here, real people, with their own stories, their own lives. I wasn't alone in this world. The world outside was vast, and I had no idea where it would take me. But one thing was certain: I was free. And that freedom, the freedom to choose, to live, to experience it all, the good, the bad, the ugly, was worth everything I had left behind. Chapter 10. The Choice. I stood on the edge of the park, the cool breeze brushing against my face. The city stretched out before me like an open road. The skyline glittered in the distance, and the lights from the street lamps cast long shadows. On the ground, I was alone, but not in the way I had been before. No longer confined to the sterile walls of the place I had called home, no longer trapped in the artificial life they had designed for me. This was real. The city around me, the people rushing by, the noise of life. It was all real. But for the first time in my life, I felt both free and lost at the same time. I had left everything behind. The city I had grown up in, the carefully constructed routines that had filled my days with nothing but quiet repetition. I had walked away from the life that had been handed to me. And now, the weight of that decision began to settle in. The truth had been unveiled. I had discovered the secret that lay hidden beneath the surface, the controlled reality I had lived in, a manufactured world designed to keep me complacent, to keep me from questioning, to keep me from living. But now, I had a choice. A real choice. And it was both liberating and terrifying. I had no idea what lay ahead. The world outside was vast and unknown. There were no guarantees, no safety nets. Nothing was promised. In the world I had left behind, everything was planned. It was predictable. But it was also a lie. The truth was far messier, far more complicated. And now I was standing in the middle of it, staring at the unknown future, trying to figure out what came next. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the breeze wash over me. It felt like the first real breath I had taken in years. There was a heaviness in my chest, but it wasn't fear. It was a mix of anticipation and uncertainty. I didn't know what I was supposed to do, where I was supposed to go, but that was the point, wasn't it? The choices ahead of me were endless. The path I had left was behind me. The life I had known was over, and I was standing at the crossroads of a new beginning, one that I had to create for myself. The question wasn't whether I could survive in this world. It was whether I was ready to embrace it. I took a deep breath and looked around. There were people walking by, living their lives in a way that felt foreign to me. They weren't like the people in the city I had escaped from. There was no scripted routine here, no controlled environment, no comfort in knowing exactly what would happen next. They were real. They were living, breathing, flawed. They were free. I felt a stirring inside me, a spark of something I hadn't felt in so long. It was freedom, but it wasn't just the freedom to go wherever I pleased or to do whatever I wanted. It was the freedom to make mistakes, to stumble, to fail, and to learn from it. The freedom to be vulnerable. The freedom to not have all the answers. The freedom to choose. That's when I saw him. He was standing at the edge of the park, watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. The man who had given me the key to my escape. The one who had revealed the truth to me. The one who had opened my eyes to the world beyond the illusion. He wasn't far away, but he wasn't close either. He was waiting for me to make my decision, waiting for me to decide if I was ready for what came. Next, for a moment I hesitated. I wasn't sure why, but something about his presence made me pause. He wasn't forcing me. He wasn't telling me what to do. But there was an unspoken understanding between us, a shared recognition that I was standing at the precipice of something monumental, the moment of truth. I walked toward him, my steps slow, deliberate. As I got closer, I could see the faint lines of weariness on his face, the same weariness I had felt in myself. He had been part of the system, just like me, but he had broken free, and now he was waiting for me to do the same. "You've made it this far," he said, his voice calm but steady. "But the hardest part is yet to come." I stopped in front of him, my hands clenched at my sides. "What do you mean?" He looked at me for a long moment, his eyes searching mine, as if weighing my every thought. "You can't just leave and expect everything to fall into place. The world out here isn't as simple as you think. It's chaotic. It's messy. People aren't perfect. Life isn't perfect. There's no safety net. There's no guarantee you'll get what you want. It's a fight. And if you want to stay free, you'll have to fight for it every single day." I swallowed, the weight of his words sinking into me. He wasn't wrong. The world outside wasn't the utopia I had imagined in my head. There would be no one handing me answers. No one protecting me from the harsh realities of life. The real world wasn't kind. It wasn't forgiving, but it was honest. And that honesty, raw, untamed, painful, was something I had been yearning for. I looked at him and nodded slowly. "I'm ready," I said, my voice stronger than I expected. "I'm ready to face it. All of it." He studied me for a moment, longer, then nodded in return. "Good. But remember, you're not just escaping something. You're choosing something. A new life, a new path. You won't be alone, but you'll have to make it your own." I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his words. He was right. This wasn't just about escaping the world I had known. It was about choosing to live in the real world, to embrace the messiness, the uncertainty, and the challenge that came with it. The future was wide open, and it was mine to create. There would be no map, no guide, no blueprint to follow. The hikes, decisions, the mistakes, and the triumphs would all be mine. I had to be ready for that. I turned and looked out at the street in front of me, the crowds moving with purpose, their lives unfolding with their own choices, their own stories. They didn't have all the answers. Neither did I. But that didn't matter anymore. I was part of this world now. I was going to live it. As I walked away from the park, stepping into the unknown with every step, I felt the weight lift from my shoulders. The choice had been made, and though I didn't know exactly what lay ahead, I knew one thing: I was free. And that freedom, that power to choose, was worth every risk, every uncertainty. Great work today. Every moment you spend practicing brings you closer to mastering your English listening and speaking skills. Remember, progress comes with patience and consistency. If this story inspired you or helped you in your learning journey, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Easy English Spark channel for more lessons and stories. Keep listening, keep speaking, and keep believing in your growth. I'll see you in the next video. Take care and keep shining.